Okay, if we talk about saving for retirement versus retirement income planning, are the tools any different for retirement income solutions than the tools we were using for saving for retirement?
Well, start with the most simple case. All right, I get Social Security, and maybe I have one asset, home equity or IRA or something. Well, it's fairly straightforward. You get your Social Security, and perhaps you need some long-term care insurance, and then you look at how you should allocate the bucket. Okay, and so for that type of plan, a tool, a graphical tool, an easy to understand tool is fantastic. And maybe we don't need the complexity, but once we get into multiple tax status of accounts, annuity, Roth, deferred IRA, non-qualified mutual fund, we have some home equity, we might have a vacation home over here, and then we have some complicated expenses. Now it quickly becomes overwhelming. And so the function of the software tool is twofold. First off, we need to be able to calculate and give advice to the advisor, help the advisor get the advice. But secondly, we need to condense all that advice down to a plan of action. Should I do it? Should I not do it? And one thing that Monte Carlo analysis is particularly good at is that you can plug in 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 variables, and you have different accounts, different taxations, different allocations. And the advisor makes a recommendation. And the Monte Carlo analysis runs tens of thousands of random models and comes back and says X% of them were successful, Y% of them were not. And it lets the advisor fine-tune until you get the X and Y% where you want them. That's one beauty of using more sophisticated software, Monte Carlo type analysis software, because the client at the end wants to know, will I be successful or not? And they don't necessarily want to go through all 50 variables with you each time you meet.
The caution there, too, is that the advisor cannot pick this thing off the shelf and go out and run it.
Absolutely not.
He or she is going to have to know what the assumptions are within that software. Otherwise, just like anything else, you can have great software or machinery and use it improperly and garbage in, garbage out. If you're not understanding the assumptions and you make recommendations based on faulty assumptions, then the results can't be expected.
And it's certainly an issue where, just as in financial planning, any assumption we use needs to be, where did you get that? Where are you coming up with that number? But when we use retirement income planning, it's very important that we use the type of software that allows us, for the more sophisticated client and the income portion of the plan, to not only help with some portfolio decisions, but to help the client see how everything comes together. How does that long-term care premium, it's going to get paid for out of one bucket of money, and maybe then we have some living expenses out of another, and we make sure we're being efficient with tax rates. And it gets very complicated very quick, as any student at this point in the course is seeing. But we really need to use a more sophisticated tool that takes all those variables into play and lets the advisor manipulate each of those variables to some extent. So as Alan was saying, you're going to use long-term equity. Well, if we're going to Monte Carlo long-term equity, what we need is a mean return. We need acceptable standard deviations of that return. And we want to make sure the software is using an acceptable mean and standard deviation range for that asset class, so forth and so on for all asset classes. And once we've become that entrenched in the software tool, we can use it well for retirement income planning.
But you're both saying that it takes some time to get familiar because these are more complicated.
I would say commit to training, commit to firm-wide training. I would say when the decision is made to adopt that type of sophisticated tool, there needs to be some sort of decision on, as a firm, we're going to commit time, we're going to commit resources, we're going to commit to keep this updated and keep current. And when we're willing to make that commitment, do we have the revenue business, to pay for that commitment and then some? And if we do, when that commitment's made, it's not just the install time. We're looking at training for each staff member who's going to be working in the software, make sure it's up to date, make sure that it stays up to date. Does the Monte Carlo software you're using take into consideration the 2008, 9, and 10 markets?
The caution there, too, is that the software tool needs to remain a tool and not the master, and never a substitute for common sense and knowing the client. The software tool may recommend a portfolio that is well beyond
the risk
tolerance or the capacity of that client. And it's the old, visual observation. When my client breaks out in hives and begins scratching when I talk about even a 60-40 mix, then sometimes you have to regroup. Or, in the absence of that, do a lot of education to bring that client, up to a knowledge where he or she can accept that kind of, that kind of allocation.
And speaking on education, and I think you really hit on this, is that when we use more sophisticated tools, at the end of the day, we get a success and failure ratio. And when we go through Monte Carlo, that's what we get. This portion, with the variables I have inputted, your plan was successful, let's say 80-90% of the time, or your plan was failed 10 or 20% of the time. And it's educating the client that, when we get to 90-95% success, that the reality is we're there. The reality is the plan's set and we're ready to go, and this is a plan that will be successful. Because if we have a bad year, what's going to happen? We're going to cut expenses, we're going to find a way to manipulate. And it's education, and it requires even more education. The more sophisticated tool certainly requires, explaining and communicating that well to the client.
Right, because a client that sees you have a 90% success rate just focuses in on the 10% failure rate.
Right, but a 90% success rate is actually, fundamentally achievable, and that's where there are some softwares, some software companies I'm familiar with, where they actually kind of have a little dashboard or some set up, and really the goal is to get the client in the green or in the success range, and they focus less on 80 to 100% success as they do as you've made it to the green, you've made it to a spot where we can maintain.
Right.
For the young advisor too, it's none of it is done in a vacuum. It's not robotic. Again, it's a tool to show and demonstrate to the client, the possible, so to speak. But in actuality, and the studies are starting to take this into effect too, the clients aren't robots, and they react to a bad economy or to a loss in their own investments, and they cut back on expenses such as going out and entertainment and cruises and trips and so on. And so, again, the software remains, I call it, and don't get me wrong on this, it's important, but the software can be effective as an elaborate visual aid to inform and educate your client on the many different moving parts in a financial plan and get them thinking about the contingencies, the possibilities, what if inflation runs away, what if my investments have a bad year, and get them ready and capable of accepting those changes. Because one thing we can be sure, as long as the future is the future, it's going to deal us some hands that we don't expect.
And one other comment as far as tools go, we talk about, usually we use retirement income analysis. We have typical financial planning software tools. We can show withdrawals out of a portfolio and give it an assumed rate of return. It doesn't have to get sophisticated in a manner that gets very, very wild. But if we are using some sophisticated tools, we can apply the same mathematical concept of a Monte Carlo simulation or bootstrapping simulation, not only to asset classes or returns, we can also apply it to things like longevity, and we can apply it to things like living expenses. All right, well certainly at this point we're just juggling the abstract, all right, because but what we can do is always set some required basic living expenses. And then we can run, if things get tough, we're going to tighten the belt. And so we might have some give and take there. But the more pieces that we use probability estimates to configure, the less reliable the outcome is. And so we're back to Alan's point that the advisor is inevitably responsible for those recommendations. And this is all a great tool, but it can get fairly abstract fairly quickly.
And it can never be a one and a done.
No,
we've created a plan,
not.
Thank you very much, collect my fee, and I'm on my way. The plan is nothing more than the initial roadmap, and it's got to be updated for the detours and the holes and the pots and the black swans that come along as they will in the future.
And just as one black swan, right? The increases in premium of long-term care costs.
There you go.
I don't know one plan that took into consideration a doubling of premiums, but yet it's happened. Yeah. So that's just, we call them black swans, but the reality is that every year or two we're going to have something out of left field that we have to be ready for.
That surprises everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Really important and helpful information.
Thank you.
Thank you.